Okay, again, welcome. This is the latest edition of the Hacks Hackers AI Real Talk series. RIP Web, AI is in your interface. So yeah, we have a great group of people here today to talk about the future of how news and information is going to be consumed by people in the AI age. Obviously, lots of news happening on all front every day. There's more things happening in developments in terms of relations with publishers, the AI companies, new things launching, stock markets going up and down, all sorts of craziness happening. So let's dive right into this. We're gonna go through. I'll introduce the panelists briefly. We'll have them each kind of take a question and talk a bit about what they're working on, and then we want to get to your questions as well. So let's just dive in. Here's our group of panelists today. You all have seen it. We have Phoebe from the Washington Post. Marcel is from Particle, a new news app. Ariane is a consultant who's worked a lot of places like Le Monde and the New York Times. Linus works with Notion on AI initiatives, and Matt from the Boston Globe. I am Bert from Hacks Hackers. Yeah, so I wanted to just go ahead and kick it off talking to Phoebe and to ask her a bit about this product, which maybe some people have already seen. As far as I know, this is the first product they've launched, kind of consumer facing around AI, the climate kind of questions answered using a GPT style interface. And yeah, I just want to ask Phoebe, like, why did we start? Why did you start with this climate, vertical as a product, and how you're thinking about, how this is going and what people are doing with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Climate Answers started it took us about 9 months from the beginning of the idea into actually launching it. We were really interested in, very apropos, I think, of this talk, trying to play around with this chat-like format that we knew people were intrigued by with the launch of ChatGPT and other sort of, chat-based clients and interfaces. I think the way that we're generally thinking about it, and I hope we'll get into this more, is that um, you know, a moment for us to grab onto as news organizations right now is really playing with the formats and the expectations that audiences may encounter elsewhere, and making sure that, they may see it elsewhere, they may, experience it, and then when they come to our news site, they're able to consume our news product through that sort of like form factor, if that makes sense. Um, why did we go with climate? Sort of two reasons. One, we had invested heavily in our climate team. We'd hired on some really incredible reporters, editors, really expanded the type of reporting and the depth of knowledge that we had there. And then also climate as a topic, thinking about it, was sort of the perfect fit. It was really data rich and data heavy. This feels like a crazy thing every time I say it, but climate news is not particularly fast moving, right? The story isn't going to change radically from like a Monday to a Wednesday. I think over the course of developing this, we found that mattered less than we thought it did, but I was really concerned that we pick a topic where we weren't setting ourselves to constantly not be able to answer the question accurately. And we had really willing collaborators, Zach Goldfarb and Juliet Elprin, who are the two editors on that desk, embraced this. They really made themselves and their staff available. Our ability to say, is this doing good? Is it able to answer the question? We felt confident on that because we had journalists working alongside us in the development and the vetting of how it replied.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it is more of an evergreen topic for sure. Can you talk at all about how it's going? Like, are people coming back to this? Are they repeatedly using it? Like, is it doing well for getting people to read more about the climate coverage that the Post had?
Yeah, it was really interesting as we thought about sort of like positioning it to our users, really making sure that they heard what we felt when we were developing this, which is that it's not a replacement for our journalists. It couldn't exist without our journalists, right? The core of it is the journalists who have reported so deeply on these topics. But it was sort of like a second bite at the apple, that you as a user might come to a story with a specific question that's informed by where you live or your family, or maybe a novel that you're reading that, makes you really curious about a topic. And the Washington Post reported answer on that might occur in the 9th paragraph of a really deeply reported story, right? So think of it as like a new interface to be able to dig in with our already published answers. We got high engagement. It performed sort of on par with other, climate coverage that we had published. And then when we looked at sort of like how people were reacting with it, if you go in and play with it, you'll see that there's several moments for you to tell us whether you think it's useful, whether it answered your question. Across the board, most users told us that it was useful, a majority of our users. And then in the feedback, we said, well, why was it useful, or what do you think about it? And not surprising to me, but still pleasing, was many people were thrilled with how concise the answers were, right? That the brevity, the conciseness, the directness was a real quality that sort of head and shouldered above. And no one complained when there are many questions you will ask it that it won't be able to answer. And people seemed fine with that, right? That it could not come up with an answer was not a negative in our readers' minds.
Okay, so they'd rather have it admit it doesn't know something than try to fabricate something. That's good to know. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, yeah, that's great to hear. And very cool. Definitely encourage people to play around with it at the URL. I wanted to go on and talk to Marcel about his app Particle, which this is some screenshots of it, which looks there's a lot going on here with the stock markets yesterday, a lot of numbers. He previously worked at Twitter and Tesla, has a lot of experience in technology, and came from that to now launch Particle, which is in a closed beta. He told me if you do go to the URL at the bottom and say you're interested in the beta, mention this talk, they'll make sure you can get in to try it out. I guess I wanted to, ask you a bit like, what you're designing this app for, like kind of what you're thinking about the user where you're building it in this way, and also like what is possible to do with LLMs and AI to build this app that wasn't really possible before.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Thank you for having me. And one of the interesting things about LLMs right now, as they're still very much in this sort of nascent emergence, as people are grappling with what the implications are and what changes and what doesn't change, because of the experience of ChatGPT, where you ask them a question and it formulates some response, and depending on what you're asking about, that response is, implicitly using information that it knows about something that it consumed, but is otherwise abstracting it away. There's this default thought of LLMs when people, conjure up a sense of how they work, that they're this thing that slurps up all the information in the world and then authors its own version of those things and effectively abstracts it away. And the way that some of these tools are written, that's very much the case. And but the utility that you can get from LLMs is so much broader than that. And one of the more intriguing capabilities that we are mostly focused on is not so much taking something and producing a summary or something, though we do have that. But increasingly, it'll become less of what is in the app. But one of the main use cases that I think is interesting is its power to identify and extract parts of the text. So you are not replacing or regurgitating, as the pejorative term is by some of the coverage, but you're rather using a sort of nuanced mechanism to extract certain aspects of the text. Examples of that might be things that are like somewhat objective, like quotes, extract all the primary source quotes, who the speaker was, the context in which they said it, and be able to do that across all of the coverage for a given story. And one of the main important abstractions of the app is the notion of a story, which is effectively accumulating all of the coverage across all the major sources that are writing about that thing, so that you can get essentially a deduplicated definitive list of the main things that are being written about. And once you're interested in one of those things and are able to dive in, there's a lot that is afforded when you have this cross-section of the coverage. And there's fancy things you can do, but there's also fairly straightforward things you can do. Like if you extract all the quotes from all of the articles, you can deduplicate them, which is not easy to do. But once you do, you can identify the most salient quotes across all those things and be able to provide this sort of direct sense of what some of the main things are. But there are other things that are less objective, like extracting, not quite less objective, but like slightly less straightforward. Being able to identify, essentially every time in an article they say something like, as originally reported by X, trying to identify, not just by publication times, which publishers can end up, not out of malice, but out of just like whatever, provide incorrect publication times. You can't simply look at publications times to know who broke a story, but across a bunch of articles, you can identify that any number of them are saying like, as originally reported by Bloomberg or whatever, and being able to capture that information. And then also there's far more complicated things that we're trying to do about extracting claims to be able to understand when material developments happen, to be able to enable things like letting people follow and get notifications for any story, not some major thing like a submersible has disappeared, which some publications allow you to follow those things, but to do it in a generalized way for anything, no matter how relatively niche it is. But if you have a sense of when all the material developments are happening, you can deliver that. So that unlocks a set of utility that, ultimately, once you do deliver that thing, and in the app, we are, featuring the articles, and we're increasingly able to sort of rank them with default orders, but based on their salience and contribution, so to speak, to the story. But you'd have other mechanisms to be able to sort and filter. But ultimately, having new mechanisms to be able to have people engage more directly and with more nuance in the sense of, I want to know what happens next in a way that the interval between those events could be weeks, it could be days, it could be hours. But having these mechanisms to be able to understand and sort of deconstruct the different properties across all the coverage and what some of the different perspectives are, to be able to aggregate those perspectives, give you a general sense of, there's such and such analysis from this publication, and then there's other analysis, which, in a sense is in attention with that other, being able to give you this map as a starting point of understanding all the different components is, now stuff that can be done in fairly automated ways, and it's largely about extraction, not about regurgitation. And so, ultimately, to answer the initial question, what we want the industry to understand is that, as Phoebe mentioned earlier, Particle doesn't exist without great journalism. Like this is not a taxi cabs versus Uber zero-sum game. Like, we just absolutely don't exist, and we're not trying to replace, and we're not trying to create synthetic articles, and we're not going to try to become a new form of like journalism, And so what we're actually trying to do is, in this sea of information that's constantly a stream, to mix metaphors, there are, within that, the people who are providing the understanding around some information that people care about. And we want to more efficiently be able to connect the people who want to understand something with the people who can provide that understanding to them. And as much as possible, rather than abstract them away, connect them more directly. So we're still in private beta. There's a lot more that we intend to build, and the contours and the experience of the app will likely be evolving, such that you shouldn't assume that the current incarnation in development is like the fully materialized vision, so to speak. But it's about doing the opposite of abstracting away. in this case. And being able to, our tagline is understand more faster, which in a sense is very vague, but is actually fairly accurate to the ambition that we have. And I think there's a subtle nuance between more and faster, which shouldn't be thought of as simply, we're just gonna have summaries of everything. And so like faster just means with less depth. The faster part is, and you can take an initial pass of getting a global sense of everything that's covered in a personalized way, because the app is very much about being able to have people express their interests and have things ranked in part according to that. But once you have that general survey, that it's systematic in the sense that you can just sort of go down this thing rather than like hop around across different things, trying to get a sample here and there and construct what everything is being covered. But you can quickly, the fast part is that, but the more part is then being able to dive in. And when you do dive in, increasingly starting to get that kind of map, that so you can see the territory and the contours, and then travel to different parts of it that you're aiming to understand more about. And that includes not only the coverage from right now, but having continuity with the chronology of how you got there.
Yeah, no, I feel
large
like
part
the
of
app has, yeah, it has all sorts of, I mean, I see, it's in beta and you kind of like are trying like, what if we do things by this, aspect or this aspect or this aspect, by article, by topic, by photos, I mean, it just gets really fascinating once you just start seeing what the LLM could do and kind of putting different spins on it to see what would actually be useful for potential, different users right all around. I see people in the chat are talking about corporate users obviously wanting to follow things deeply, things like that for sure. I wanted to bring in Linus next. Hey there, Linus. Linus has been doing a lot of research for many years around AI, large language models, kind of thinking about information interfaces. There's a quote he had from a piece way back in May of 2022 that I wanted to mention. He said, compared to the rate at which AI capabilities are progressing, I think interfaces to guide and control such capabilities are worryingly stagnant. Um, Basically, I think where he was getting at was, everybody's putting a chat interface on things, which is kind of the initial thing that some people are doing. But I'm really curious to hear, based on what you're learning from Notion and based on other research you're doing, like what, I mean, provoke us. Like, what would you want to see? What would be a crazy different way of thinking about this that people should be experimenting with and trying? Oh, you're muted, Linus.
Classic. The big idea that I was trying to get people in the industry to understand at the time, and I think we're kind of slowly absorbing now and adopting now, is that language models actually have at least two different useful capabilities. One is being able to imitate a conversational kind of interaction with a human, but then a pretty separable second capability is this ability to look at some piece of content and transform it into some other form, or do some basic reasoning over it, or things like that. And so what people call, we can debate how appropriate the word is, but what people call reasoning capabilities, uh, you can use separately than the kind of conversation chat capability. And I think a lot of the best uses, the most reliable, especially in kind of mission critical knowledge work, the best uses of language models uses the capability of these models to understand and make sense of content and connect content and find connections, and uses that and tries to minimize the degree to which they rely on, as we have already seen in this hour, rely on content generation. So when I think about applications of that idea in media and in content, I think the one kind of exciting framing to me is that with language models, there's a way to have the content that the user interact with be a function of not just what the original author of that thing wrote, but a function of that in addition to the user's interaction with the system. So if you take like a basic kind of question answering system, like what Phoebe was alluding to earlier, the answers that the user gets is a function of both the reporting that's on the underlying reporting that's done, which is critical, but also the kinds of users the question asks, or maybe the follow-up, or maybe the system generate or suggests some questions, and there's some interesting interaction whereby the user can go down a rabbit hole that neither the author nor the user expected on their own to be able to go down. So the overall experience is a function of both the user interacting with the system as well as the content underlying the system, and so it's a more of a living thing. I think previous to language models, we've had versions of this for quantitative data. Like there are various newsrooms that do extremely high quality reporting with data graphics that users can interact with and explore. And using that for kind of data rich domains like finance, you can deliver kinds of insight or a kind of like engagement with the source material or the domain to users that or readers that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get by just showing static text or graphics on the page. I think one use case of language models that's particularly exciting to me from an interface perspective is being able to do the same for unstructured content of any type. And so perhaps like what Particle is doing, or perhaps if you're interested in financial news, or if you're interested in sort of like social sentiment about things or politics, there's lots of real-time news sources where you may want to try to understand what's happening, not at the level of individual pieces of content that's coming out, like individual reports, but at the level of overall, how's the sentiment towards this topic, or overall, how much are these kinds of communities interacting with each other versus these kind of communities, and those higher level things, analyzing and understanding and somehow visualizing those interactions to readers. I think language models can facilitate better by sort of transforming these individual documents or these data sets of documents into charts or graphics or interesting other kinds of formats, by not by chat interactions, but by having these models distill those down into specific sentiment classifications or things like that. So I think the bottom line for me is, I think in the same way that language models kind of separate out its capabilities from the delivery mechanism, or we can separate out the delivery mechanism of chat from its underlying capabilities and use it. I think perhaps in the content media world, it's good to separate out language models' use in reporting and the underlying journalism versus the distribution mechanism or the way that the user interacts with the knowledge. Where I think the underlying kind of content and thinking and journalism is obviously critical, but I think there's a lot of innovation to be had in the what do I actually see when I go on a site or look at a piece of content, and what can I interact with, and how through my interaction with the system, in addition to the underlying content, can I learn something that I otherwise would not have been able to learn by just looking at a static piece of media.
Yeah, no, I wonder. I mean, it makes me think about all the source material that goes into the reporting too, and how that could be made much more accessible to consumers potentially, or even, I guess, enterprise customers if it was some really exclusive data, in a much more easier way. Because now again, it could normalize things, let you kind of take different views on and perspectives on data. There's so much potential there for sure, to
Yeah.
do work with things that normally just end up on the cutting room floor in somebody's notebook somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to bring in Matt, from the Boston Globe, which kind of is totally related to this too. I invited Matt because I saw him post on Threads. Uh, he said this: every single news organization is asking how AI can support its legacy products, not how it can build new innovative products. It's hurting my soul. So I guess I wanted to ask Matt, like, I hope his soul is not too hurt. And just curious, like, what kind of things would you love to see? And what do you dream about building? What are you all working on at the Boston Globe?
Bert, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I try not to get too dramatic on threads. Uh, yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. And this session is warming my soul. It is not hurting my soul. But I think one of the things that has uh, really bothered me, but also made me incredibly excited, is that I think for the past, however long we've been doing, digital journalism. I'm going to borrow a phrase, like it has not largely been a digital revolution, but it's been that digital renovation. I can't remember who coined that term, but I think it's incredibly accurate, right? Where like fundamentally the way that people produce and consume information has largely stayed the same through an analog to digital transition, right? It is I am as a news organization, going to send people out to do reporting. Those people are going to take that reporting and turn it into a linear story that is then like a one size fits all or a one size fits none approach. And that had to work when we had content, printed to paper, where just the technology behind printing to paper made it so that, the only way that would ever scale is if everyone received the same information. But now we have this opportunity to, print to pixels. And we have these incredible devices that are all interconnected and run code. And there is a true opportunity to kind of like move past this one size fits all approach, right? And the version of the news that I consume should very likely be personalized and tailored to me in a whole bunch of different ways than say Bert you or Phoebe you, right? Like if we're reading about, healthcare reform, it would be really helpful for that to be localized down to who my congressional representatives are and how they voted on these types of things, or my personal medical history, or where I'm at in life, and do I have a family? Do I not have a family? All of those types of things. And so I think that there's this amazing opportunity, and I think, what Particle is doing is kind of bleeding towards this, which makes me so excited. I've been in the Particle beta, and like within 5 minutes, I was like, Chewie, we're home type of moment from the Star Wars movies, where it's like this is feeling very much like the future, and it feels very much like where we're going. To have this opportunity to build these types of things. And one of the things that I worry is I talk to a lot of folks, not folks in this panel, but other folks in the industry, where there's so much concentration on like, how do we use generative AI tools to improve the quality of our articles, where it's like, that's great, we should be doing that, but we should be thinking beyond like this paper dime of like we treat our digital articles like we treat articles that we print to paper. And I think that there's a big opportunity to change that. And a lot of this stuff wasn't, possible 5 years ago, and now is becoming incredibly possible. And, especially when we have, products that are premium and people pay for, right? Like Washington Post, Boston Globe, like these people are paying a hefty subscription price every month for a premium product. We should be thinking about how we build products that are at the level of quality of our journalism, right? Like we produce excellent journalism. Like the product should match that level of quality. And I think that's just a big opportunity, and I'm so excited about it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, and you want to build a direct relationship. You want people to log into your site. So what are you giving them of value because they logged in? I mean, and is it just getting past a paywall, or is it actually like some of the things Matt is talking about that would be enabled, right? To really give personalized, relevant content, data, whatever it is, in much more interesting ways that are way more tailored to you. I mean, that is the really fascinating thing about where this is going, which there was a question earlier that I'm going to get back into in a little bit about what that means for how journalists do journalism too. I just wanted to come to Ariane next. You've done work with a lot of different publishers and consulting with them on AI, and you kind of mentioned this thing ahead of the panel, talking about molecular units. Sorry for my tongue twister there. And just, kind of as you think about that with like the campaign, election coverage, I guess I was just kind of curious to get your little brainstorm on this and where you were thinking all that could go, and what are the, upsides and potential pitfalls of doing things with that.
Thanks, Bert. Hi, everyone. Yeah, we were kind of talking about this earlier, but so my background is in building, large CMSs and a lot of the attendant tools that you find in a publishing platform. And I've moved to sort of helping companies build their sort of 2 to 3 years investment and capital investment and operation strategy around this. But I do love a tool. Uh, and and one thing that is really complicated and this very much connects with what Matt was saying with how we create. Oh, is that me doing this? sorry, with how we create journalism is that we create it in a manner that's convenient for journalists. So one aspect, and in a manner that they've been trained to do often, but also in a manner that is meaningful for them because they follow a story day in and day out. And the notion of a story having an arc, what is today's lead? Or if they're writing to maybe a higher level of analysis or view, they're writing to, what has kind of happened in the past month, what has been, but this assumes a lot of things about your readers, your users, which is that they want that, and B, that they want it at the same pace and rate and interest as everybody else. And of course, I think as we move to having more, basically capabilities, technical capabilities to possibly store the underlying pieces of news in a manner that makes them more discrete, we also allow ourselves the possibility, and it's very much an interesting product problem, but to think about what people can get in return. And some people might want exactly the kind of daily stories because they're really into something and they follow it every day. And that is actually their optimum, product to receive. But other people, as evidenced by the interactions that Phoebe's had with her own tools, want just the facts, ma'am. And actually not just even just the facts, this one fact, this one narrow little thing, because other parts of it have been either, acquired for them elsewhere, or for whatever reason, they just don't care. And you're kind of not necessarily helping as a news organization. If your answer is, your problem is what it is, but be that as it may, my answer to this is this goddamn daily paper that, has the answer that you're looking for. Should you be lucky enough to find the right one, and you'll have to read the whole thing. So what do our publishing systems and our creators, basically get to create, and what do we store? What is a mechanism for them to do that is, functional, and I would say, and this is the stuff that we were talking about earlier, but agreeable to their brain. And this is actually in many ways the hardest problems, at least one that I know that I've hit many, like a wall that I've hit many times. Like there are some sort of kind of correct ways to do things from a database perspective, from a vector database perspective, from an entity recognition perspective, but they're not necessarily very livable for humans. And I think what NLP, I wouldn't even say specifically generative AI, which frankly inserts all kinds of, complicated things into the mix, but NLP might actually afford us the way to reverse engineer the creation of those molecules of news, these relationships between things, so that the output can take many different shapes, whether they're the single answers that Phoebe, has in her product, whether they're the entire threads that Marcel has in his own app, whether it's the dream of Matt, asking like, I only care about what my end users care about. But ultimately, you have to find some ways to kind of go from how journalists have gathered things to how they've, input them into something, which might be different to how it's stored, and then different to how it's, regurgitated back out. And if anyone has great thoughts and great ideas, I can discuss this with anyone all day, every day. I love this problem.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, regurgitates. I guess we have to come up with a more elegant
and find a better word than that also.
Yeah. Linus, you mentioned that there's something from Notion you wanted to share that corroborates
Yeah.
what we're talking about here. Yeah.
I loved a lot of those points about kind of rethinking what the delivery mechanism is. I think one of the big, so Notion's a product company, obviously, and one of the big things that both the engineers and the designers on our team had to slowly wrap our minds around when we started building AI products is that we're fundamentally designing like a dynamic experience. And designers are usually, and also kind of an unpredictable stochastic experience. And so designers are usually, especially the really particular detail-oriented kind of crafty designers that we have on our team, love to know exactly which pixels are going to be where and what color on every screen that they design. And I think they a lot of their love of their craft is manifest through the kind of detail-oriented nature of the work. And one of the things that we have to wrap our minds around when we started building AI products is that sometimes you just can't. Like sometimes when you start using AI for things, you may not know exactly how long the output is or exactly what the tone of voice these things are going to use when responding to the user. And AI adds a new dimension to the design, which is not just designing the pixels on the screen and where things are statically, but designing aspects of the experience. So over time, we've learned to put as much effort into sort of designing the character of the thing that the user is interacting with, if it's a conversational interface, or designing things like the writing style and format of a summary, or even thinking about the right trade-off between the quality and the fidelity of the answer versus the speed of generation, because those kinds of things matter. And I think if you look at other domains of software design or experience design that have had dynamism like this for much longer, like video games, there it's just kind of known that a part of designing a video game is designing things like how exactly animations feel or how exactly these characters interact with you. But I think it's relatively new to products and especially to content. But I think the in the content world, I get the sense that the people that are responsible for designing the user experience may have an aversion to the stochasticity of language models, because it feels like a kind of way to inject unpredictability into the experience. But I think you can sort of flip that on its head and say, okay, this is a new dimension of design. And it is controllable, and a lot of the engineering work that's gone into this over the last year, and that we'll hopefully see for the next many years, is to figure out how to control these systems in the way that we want. And so I think the more productive way to look at perhaps is to say this is another really interesting dimension of design, is like designing the behavior of these systems. And how can we use that as another avenue to differentiate our brand or improve the experience? Because ultimately, if you're shipping something that's a dynamic experience, that the behavior of that, the speed, the tone, the structure of the output is what determines a lot of the experience.
Yeah, no, I that's really interesting to hear that's, it's definitely like yet another frontier for designers to think about, and again, wouldn't be possible without LLMs. And the way that you kind of do prompt engineering and all these things, I mean, it's very much like natural language thinking about asking, the model to behave in a certain way or do certain things, and that it can actually understand that. And you can kind of tailor things to get better and better based on how you prompt the model. I see Alex mentioned here in the chat the business model, and that is the one question that definitely came up from a few people also ahead of this discussion on your RSVP, is like, what happens to the business model for journalism if people are getting answers through other LLMs, other interfaces. Obviously, it's taken a while for the news industry to kind of come around to doing paywalls and subscriptions and things like that. And now we just kind of are sort of getting the hang of that. But now, yet again, the technology moves on. I just wanted to throw it open to everybody. I mean, here's, OpenAI is launching their Search GPT prototype. Obviously, there's been the whole thing around Perplexity, using people's content in summaries, and now they launched a publishers program. So yeah, if anybody would like to talk a bit about this, Marcel, how you're working with publishers, or Phoebe, how the Washington Post is thinking about the business model, I'd love to hear your views on that.
I mean, but it's funny, I wanted to say something when we were talking earlier about just sort of like the user expectations. I will say, and then I promised to talk about business models, that I think anytime we have sort of new technology or new tools come in, part of the exciting moment we find ourselves in is that it's like permission to stop looking only at our usual competitive set. We can look at video games. We can look at some advertising agency who's just come up with like a totally clever, fun tool. That's sort of the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think that embracing that and saying, you know what, it's time for us to stop looking at, to pick on my co-panelists, like I shouldn't just look at the Boston Globe, right? Not because I don't like the Boston Globe, but because like there's just other things out there, and they may embrace and engage and start building with this technology before my sort of my traditional news cohort necessarily has. And I think from a business model standpoint, and I'm not the first to point this out, there's been many thoughtful sort of takes on this, but this is not the first time that the news, I don't know, ecosystem, if you will, has been faced with having to grapple with a technology that potentially threatens our business model, right? In some ways, this feels like a very sort of old playbook. And if you have backgrounds in video, which I do, it's like, oh, we're pivoting to AI as we pivoted to video. Like there was this joke where it was like, the video's square, it's vertical, it's 360. It's like, this is another problem. The opportunity is for us to focus on the new relationships we can build with our users and the sort of user expectations that they bring, as opposed to just saying, what does Facebook want, right? To take a really old video-based metaphor there, right? So we shouldn't just be saying, what do the companies want from us? How are we engaging with them? We should say, how are our users engaging with those companies? What are the expectations our users are bringing to us after playing around with AI-powered tools or, their exposure to LLMs? That's, I think, the way that, as an industry, not just the Washington Post, certainly I can't speak for the Washington Post's entire business model, but I think that's where the opportunity is for us.
Now, Marcel, I mean, I showed on this slide earlier, like you do have links to the articles. So yeah, how are you working with publishers on that?
We've talked to basically all publishers, and we already have some partnerships in place and are working on many others, and have a longer term vision as we become more established of how we would want to scale that out. But to my point earlier that I was making about trying to connect the people who want to understand something with the people who can provide that understanding, and I think echoing some of Matt's points about sort of current formats and approaches versus the implications of new formats and approaches. There's a lot of hard work and problems to solve in order to achieve this kind of mythical future I'm describing, but part of our objective, at least to talk about it from the perspective of directionally what our ambitions are, and is on a given story, there may be 50 things covering it. And some of that is original reporting, some of that is thoughtful analysis, and some of it is in part because of the pressures and forces at play with current business models in publishing, is effectively humans doing summary more so than not, and the publications that do that in some cases aren't doing it in other cases, but there's this real heterogeneous variability in that content. And if we can successfully do all these different types of extraction and triangulate and get a sense of like where the value and information is. And someone in the comments earlier was saying, like, when I was referencing as an example, extracting who did the original reporting, and said, do users actually care about that? And a few might, but that example is more about capturing a signal that's important as a second order signal, where I'll put it this way. I would like to get to a point where some journalist or publication, whatever, working on something knows, if I provide some valuable insight, if I provide important information, people will see it and I'll be compensated for doing that. And the way that they see it, the surface that they see it on, wouldn't necessarily be on an article, in a page, although you could be able to get to the fullness of that. But if you can identify who is providing value and compensate them for doing it, that's the sort of vague high level sense of it. And I'm not being vague to be, I'm happy to talk through details of how to potentially do that. But if I'm just giving the general sense of it is to do that, which I think aligns incentives a lot better than some of the existing ways in which things work, and people publishers invest their time doing things out of sort of existential necessity that they otherwise would probably rather not be doing. And we want to help alleviate the need to do that.
Marcel, I think it's the future that you're kind of outlining there, I think kind of helps refactor the media ecosystem in a really productive way, right? Like if like what you're talking about in the vision that you're communicating, like holds and gets traction, that that is a huge that would have a ton of momentum to help refactor this into just a much more productive space. And I think I had the fortune and misfortune of being the P&L owner for one of our sites, and like really 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 diving deep into the economics of content, and I think that we largely ignore rewrites that are happening across the web of a whole bunch of original content, and we just take that as part of the modern media ecosystem, but then get really upset when machines do it, right? Where it's like, no, like we had a campaign that we ran back in like 2017 or 2018 that was called According to the Boston Globe, and it was a television spot of just like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, like all of the television stations just being like, well, according to the Boston Globe, according to the Boston Globe, according to the Boston Globe, right? And it's like we've just taken summarization and this building off of each other for so long. If we can track that reporting provenance back to the person who did it and have the value follow through from an economic standpoint, I think that largely just makes things a whole lot better, both economically and from a media ecosystem perspective.
And I do want to clarify one point, which is that because some article says, according to original reporting by X, Y, and Z, that doesn't exclude that article from contributing a lot of value. So there's some cases like where the provenance is important, and there's other cases where, regardless of the provenance, the contribution that's being provided is important and valuable. So I just wanted to clarify that this is not about like some arms race to just stick some content out so that you were first, because ultimately I hope that a thoughtful, holistic analysis will triangulate arbitrage like that.
Yeah, I think that makes a whole lot of sense. And I think largely you just had these kind of blunt tools, right? It's like, where do people spend their time? Like, does a person visit a page or not? And being able to atomize a lot of that stuff and understand like, oh, this is a compilation, and get there. I will say, I don't think, if we're talking about like Search GPT and Perplexity, I don't think blue links are gonna, like small little blue links at an end of a summarization are gonna do a whole lot for publishers. Especially when the whole point is like, if you do a great summary, a click should not really be necessary. Especially when it's, a chat interface where follow-up on curiosity is, typing another question, not clicking a blue link. So we need to figure that out. I'm really hoping that whether it's OpenAI or someone allows, the creation of a marketplace, right? Where it's like, if I'm a Boston Globe subscriber, a WAPO subscriber, I can authenticate my subscription with that platform, right? And then at that point, get access to all of that content from, a RAG perspective. But
can I just follow up on that?
Sure. Yeah.
Which is, though being able to technologically link all those different subscriptions would be great, but my hope is that we increasingly don't need to do that, but effectively achieve the same thing, which is, I agree that just having the link is insufficient, and in a sense, almost like the opportunity cost. An interesting constraint that increasingly I've tried to work with is, what if the LLM never produced outputs, and the only thing you never actually saw text from an LLM, you only ever saw text that the LLM identified. And to the extent to which you do see text from an LLM, it's more of a caption than the image, so to speak, to provide some context or explanation. And if the LLM is identifying those things well and presenting those directly and providing a little context, And the mere, like a user merely seeing that, and then another user coming and merely seeing that, automatically is sending money to the publication from which that came. Then people could have subscriptions, sure, et cetera, but it's not the only avenue for being able to be compensated. And like increasingly the LLM kind of, ideally, I would hope that you could use Particle, maybe not now, but in the future, and you wouldn't immediately think like, oh, this is like a LLM app. You wouldn't even think about the LLM because it basically would be not front and center, but the content would be front and center, and there would be direct links to meaning financial links tied to the presence of that content.
Linus, did you have a comment you were going to make? Or sorry, and Ariane too.
Somewhat related comment, I think. I'm not less from this world than I think most of the other panelists here, and so I come from a different lens. But I, not necessarily this panel, but sometimes when I kind of observe the discourse happening around content and media and AI, I get the sense that a lot of the conversations are about how can this ecosystem reap the financial benefits of the value that it's creating while staying in the role of like a pure information producer, rather than thinking about like when users are going to tools like ChatGPT or Perplexity, clearly they're going there as opposed to the news sites directly because there's some extra value that they're getting, whether it's better search, or as simple as better search, or maybe it's some kind of aggregation and curation, or maybe it's the fact that they can more deeply personalize their results. There's something extra that they're getting. And so and I think a lot of the discourse is focused on why I forget exactly who said it, but someone else said it earlier. A lot of publishing is still concentrated on the same form of content as print publishing, which is a static piece of media. And I wonder if there's more sort of an equally productive discussion to be had on the side of can publishers and the sort of journalism side of this ecosystem try to reach up to what the users are asking for, and say, clearly they're asking for these other things on top of the kind of raw reporting that's happening. From an experience perspective, how can these platforms like reach up and provide a little more of the value of whether it's curation or kind of better personalization or things like that.
Yeah, I wanted to add something, and it's very much along the lines of where Linus, I think, is going, which is the, I think necessary need, great work, to kind of interrogate what users are reliably telling us when they escape our news publications and they make habits elsewhere, including for things that we fundamentally do provide them. And there is a tendency in journalism, in which I've been for many years, and so I say this with love, to believe that we're right and they're wrong. They're wrong to want what they want. They're wrong to not appreciate the amazingness that we produce day in and day out. And if they're not seeing it, it's because we haven't managed somehow to convince them. But surely we know, and they just have yet to see that truth. And I've also worked in deep tech, much more like sort of pure tech. And I've learned from that side of the world, more so Linus's, that the user's never wrong to want what they want. I mean, with the exception of guns and, and killing each other, but I'm sure the NRA would even take issue with that one. So if we are able to kind of like look at what are kind of new capabilities helping us to meet the users where they are. And I think a lot of that is frankly brevity, and brevity is not just brief in word, it's brief in efficiency. It's this thing, not this other random stuff. There's plenty of times, and the blue links, to Marcel's point, like they have to be there because some percentage will want to deeper, and we should not make it harder for them to, identify provenance, read deeper, do whatever it is that they want out of like the next step in their learning journey or their, knowledge journey. But the argument that the new tools should be about producing that thing that users are basically telling us they may or may not want anymore, and maybe never really wanted in the way they just didn't have the option for something else. problematic when Google of the world come in and they are like, look at my knowledge panel, and everyone is like, what do you mean the movie schedule is no longer being looked at on my site and is now just plastered at the top of that Google search form? How dare you? And it's like, they did the thing that the users wanted. Sorry. So the opportunity is there, right, for us to, basically have lower costs, being smarter and being more efficient at creating a variety of ways to consume news. If we argue with ourselves and we argue with our users and insist on just producing the same old stuff and find ways for these tools to just produce the same old stuff, we will still be wrong. Not because the tool is wrong, but because we're wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, user needs for sure. Solve user problems, not your own problems. And figure out what the real problem is. Problems, not solutions. Another phrase to think about. Yeah. We're running short on time. There were a couple questions I guess I wanted to get in here. Also, just to tease, we're getting close to the end. There is another talk we have in the series, and we're going to have some more, but we have one coming up. Nevin just shared the link here in the chat on the election. Is the first AI election an opportunity or nightmare for democracy? September 10th. So please sign up for that. The link is there in the chat. Why not both? Could be both. And speaking of potential nightmares, yes, not to end on a down note, but I think a couple of people were asking, like, how can we experiment? I'm going to phrase this in a more positive way. How can we like use all these exciting tools, but also think about, what are the limitations? We want to move quickly, we want to try things, but obviously there are well-known, issues potentially with how LLMs work, that they don't quite understand, the real world. They're basically just, taking a bunch of words and kind of shrinking them down to something else. So how, I guess I would ask, like, I'm curious for Phoebe, for example, how much they really tested this ahead of time to make sure things were up to the post standards before they put this out there. And that would really go for everybody here. Like how do you think about this when launching these products?
I still abide by something that a boss 4 jobs ago said to me at the time I was working for a nonprofit, and we were arguing about a headline. I don't think it was a particularly good headline. I don't know why I was really trying to die on that hill. But my boss said to me, ultimately, he said, okay, I don't like this headline, but I'll let you go with it as long as you are ready to stand up before our board and defend it. And so, I mean, what that situation is changes if you're not working in a nonprofit context with a board. But, like if you're willing to go before, now at the Washington Post, I think about like, the department heads meeting. Can I go before that department heads meeting and defend what I'm about to put out there, right? Do I have a good explanation for why it can't answer questions that we absolutely have published reporting on, right? Can I make a case that we're going to learn something as an organization, that it's going to help us better serve our users? That's the point at which I feel like we're sort of ready to go. So that's my own sort of internal metric that I go for. Can I hold this up to my toughest critics and have them come away maybe not agreeing with me, but at least feeling like I've sort of made a good case? I think is a way to think about it. Testing, we did extensive testing. And I will say, I actually set up the testing and I took myself out of the loop on that. I asked Anne Gerhardt, who's one of our deputy managing editors, if she would be my proxy in the testing. I thought it was important that I wasn't sort of the recorder and the temperature taker of it. And then we set up, I mean, to be clear, we had done months of testing before this, but our final round of testing was climate journalists and sort of people who had worked with our climate journalists on stories, tech journalists, right, who were covering this as sort of an industry topic. And then I don't remember what I termed the invite, but I know that it was basically like my haters. Like it was like all the people in the newsroom who were like, what is AI? Why are we even building with it? And also people who were curious, but like a lot of haters. Gotta love your haters. They're good for you. They keep you honest. And then I had Anne sort of sitting at the table. It wasn't me. And she was sort of running the testing and moderating and hearing the objections, et cetera. And I think sort of setting that up. So it was really like, I could truly say I wasn't in the room. I had other people kind of running this. People felt like they could say terrible things about the product and they weren't saying it to my face. That helped me really get confidence in sort of what we were launching.
I'm happy to add a couple of points from a more technical perspective and maybe from a product side. I think broadly, I think you can group these kind of generative applications into one of two categories. The category A is like your correctness is measured as a probability. Like sometimes there are applications where it is okay to ship something that's 99% correct because the other 1% you can rely on the user to double check the information or it's obvious or something like that. And then there's a bunch of other times when you can never be wrong and you want some verifiable way to always know that that your final answer that you're presenting the users, right? In the second category, I think we're still rather limited, but I think of these models as more of a guide for organizing or searching the space of possible solutions. Like maybe use it to sort existing information by what the model thinks is most relevant, or to like automatically highlight or to extract information, as I think Marcel noted. And these are applications where maybe the model can be sort of wrong in interpretation, but it certainly won't be wrong in content. Um, in the first category, which is more what Notion deals in, um, by far the area that as a team or our engineering team is invested the most into and reap the most benefits from is all of our infrastructure around evaluating these systems. And a lot of our uh, budget for running inference in these models, a lot of our engineering time goes into thinking about when we make a change to these systems, how do we know that the things that we were afraid the model was going to make a mistake on are still performing well? And something interesting that I think Phoebe alluded to earlier that I think we've learned kind of perhaps more slowly, painstakingly over time is when you're building these evaluation systems, you don't just want engineers and sort of technical experts on it. You want subject matter experts. And so within Notion, we have perhaps slightly overqualified, but we have experts in linguistics testing our systems and considering their ability to do things like translation and question answering correctly. I have friends in firms that do design or AI assisted kind of legal document review that are hiring either using their designers on staff or hiring legitimate lawyers to help build evaluation frameworks and systems, how to think about how correct these systems are and when they're allowed to be wrong. And so I think in these more probabilistic regime, evaluation is certainly critical to think about, but I think it's also good to know that you can be technically rigorous about evaluation, and it doesn't just have to be about how do we feel that the model is doing.
We're over time. I feel like we could talk on and on about a lot of this stuff. I want to keep talking about this. There's so much more to talk. Um, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today with all their amazing insights and experience. I want to thank all of you for joining and sticking around late. I know some people had to go earlier, but I don't want to keep you more. But yeah, have a great rest of your day, everybody. Great to talk with you all and see you hopefully soon. Cheers.